and welcome to the next episode of the Backflow Burner series. If you have not watched the brainstorming episode, you should head back and watch that before you begin this one. It is really important to thoroughly plan out your project before you begin, because this is a fairly complex project. You have to consider your main detail, you have to consider the framework and your smoke path. So there's lots of things that you really need to be considering before you actually start working on the project. And that's all before you start considering the structure of working with clay and how you're going to be creating these things, what techniques you'll be using, and what types of designs will be structurally sound. So we're going to just talk about my examples during this project, and typically in my instructional videos I do like to show step-by-step instructions. However, with this project, because there's so many different types of backflow burners, you've got the waterfall, you have just the main detail focused burner, you also have the framework. So 3 different types, and that makes it a little bit tricky to show you a specific demonstration. And so instead of showing you just step by step how to create one thing and having only one possible outcome, I'm going to show you my journey. I'm going to just show you how I created this project. So I'm going to do it along with you, and I'm going to just show you my process and a lot of the techniques that I'm using in hopes that it will relate to yours. So even though it won't be exactly the same as your project, I do think that it will be beneficial for you to watch all of these steps and see how someone who has a little bit more experience goes about this project, just so you can kind of keep that in mind as you are addressing your project. So let me tell you how I got started. To begin, I created those 4 brainstorm drawings, and I had a lot of different ideas for this project, so I just drew 4 different possibilities, and then I went through and starred all of the things that I liked from all 4 of those drawings. So that is shown in the brainstorm episode, and if you haven't watched it, head back to that and make sure you do that step first. So once you've completed your 4 drawings, you're going through and finding all of your favorite parts about them, and then you're going to combine it in your official project plan. So this is my project plan. I didn't take a whole lot of time to sketch it. It doesn't have to be perfect, but what I was doing was thinking through what things I wanted to incorporate into my project. So I am working with more of a framework style design. So I've got this lifted section that's in the background with the cone that's up at the top, and the smoke is just coming down. I have this flower that my dog Frida is sitting on, and then these little scalloped edges off to the side with the base, and then the flower is raised so that the smoke can kind of collect underneath it. And so this was my project plan, and I was thinking things through and what I wanted them to look like. And once I finished my project plan, I decided that for my project and for myself, it was really useful to complete a small practice just to see how things kind of came together. And I did learn a lot about my design as I was creating it, just a small version. I went through and did this very quickly. This step should be something that you can do in about 1 class period. I don't want you to waste all of your time making the mini version before you actually get started on the big version. So this part of your project should be very brief, and you're going to just use 1 class period to create a mock-up. All right, so this is just your design put together so that you can see it 3-dimensionally. It is not super detailed. It is not what it's going to look like in the end, because it should have a lot more detail since you'll have the entire rest of the quarter to be making this. So I went through and completed this little practice. I did not score and slip anything. I did not take the time to blend. I did not take the time to add all of my intricate little details that I plan on adding. For example, I have my dog Frida, who I had planned to make much more detailed, and I didn't for this. Same with like my flowers. I just kind of like balled up little pieces, stuck them there just as placeholders. This is just a placeholder. You're just trying to see what it will look like when you have everything combined. But this is also really helpful in developing your plan, because I realized that some of my ideas in my project plan sketch didn't work out the way that I thought they were going to in real life. And so that is why I think that this mock-up is a really great idea for you to just have a small version of what you're making and kind of like work through all of your problems for your project before you're actually making your final, and it matters a lot more. So we're going to start by just making this mock-up, and I'm going to take you through some of my main details and explain what changed in my design and what you might consider for yours. Before we talk about how I created this, I kind of want to break it down so you can see exactly what's happening, because it is a little complicated, and because it's not very nicely made right now, because it's just my mini version, I didn't take very long to create this, and so you can see it's like really not that awesome looking. But this is something you'll complete in one class period, so it should be pretty basic. I didn't score and slip any of this together. It's just sort of for me to see whether this design works well or not. So what I had planned was a combination of the different types of burners. So on the back wall, you can see that there's this little hole up at the top, and that's where I'll have my first incense cone, because I did plan to have 2. So on the back, you can see there is a little ledge that will support that cone on the back side, and then the smoke will come out of this hole right here, and it'll just create a stream that's going down. And so I incorporated the waterfall design because I think that that's a really cool way to play with the path of your smoke. And so I made a small leaf, a medium leaf, and then a larger leaf so that it kind of bounces from one to the next. And so that'll be in the background. And I decided to incorporate some flowers just in the corners where these pieces were coming together to add a little bit more decoration. So I've got the waterfall of smoke in the back, but I planned for a second incense cone, and I placed it behind my dog Frida. So this is not attached, and I'll probably attach the actual flower to the base, but I'm not going to attach my dog Frida, and the reason why is because she is the secret location of my second incense cone. So I'm going to be placing my second incense cone in her back. So that's where it's going to be, so that it will kind of fill this bottom with like a pool of smoke. That was my goal. So I'm gonna have the smoke coming down from the wall, and then I'll have a pool of smoke essentially that's coming out and filling this base. And so I've got this section where the cone will be, and I'm actually gonna leave her separate so that it's easy to access and I can pick her up, put the cone in, and then put her back. And you'll notice that in this hollowed out space, there's actually a hole that's leading out, so that I can line that hole up with the hole that's in this little flower piece. And you'll notice that I've got holes all the way around. So we'll probably make that look nicer, obviously, for the project, but it was just kind of something I didn't even think of doing until I started working with clay. And so that was something that really did change in my project as I was designing it with clay for the first time, was that I wanted to have the holes coming through the flower stem and have the smoke kind of going through my dog Frida as like an easy access point to help fill that base with smoke. So that's my essential plan. I created this base just with a slab, which is a flat piece of clay, cut out a circle, cut out this strip to put around it, and then I plan to add a bunch of really detailed flowers surrounding it. So that's my general plan, but I would really like to talk with you about all the things that I learned after creating this and what I need to know moving forward, so that as I'm creating this as a larger piece and I'm taking a long amount of time, I am going to talk about what you need to do to make sure that this doesn't dry out as we're working on it throughout the quarter. So let's get started talking about how we're going to make these things for our final project. So the first question you should ask yourself after you have made your mini is, where are my thinnest areas? And the reason why you're asking that question is because the thinnest parts of your project will dry the fastest. And if we're working on this project for an extended amount of time, especially with days in between where you're not visiting or able to spray down your project and revive it, it is really important that you do not start with your thinnest pieces. All right, so for me on my project, the wall is clearly the thinnest. It's very, very skinny. I made it with the slab roller, so it's very flat and thin. So that is going to dry very quickly. In fact, just looking at it now, I can see that it's starting to turn that light brown. So it's already drying out, and I just made it today. So if you were creating that part of your project, your final project, and you started with your walls and you made those walls and you had them done for one class, then you came in to your next class to work on it, they'll be dry and you won't be able to add anything to it. So you really need to be strategic in the way that you're planning this out. And so the first question you asked yourself is, what is the thinnest part of my project? That is going to be the last thing that you make for this project. All right. The second question you should ask yourself after you've made your mini is, what is my most detailed part? For me, it's probably a mixture of the dog, Frida, and my flowers that I'll be making. So those are going to be what I start with. And looking at those two options as my most detailed parts, I'll probably start with Frida because she's the thicker part, right? If I started with my flowers, first of all, I don't have anything to attach them to yet, so they would just be stuck in my bag and drying. So I'm probably going to start with my main detail, which is Frida. And so I'll begin by creating her, and part of the reason why I'm starting with that is because it's good to choose the things that are most difficult to start with and get those made so that you can have the sizing already kind of figured out. Whereas if I made this base and the flower first, and I was trying to make my most difficult part to match the size, then that's when it gets really tricky, because I could spend a really long time making that dog and then it might not fit. So it's nice to start with the trickier thing, make that first, and then you'll just take the simpler things to create and add those in after, and you can match the size a lot easier. So I'm going to start with my most detailed, difficult part to create, which is Frida. So just a couple of things that you should be thinking about as you're starting. First of all, which areas of your project are thicker than your thumb, or will be once they're full size? So for me, Frida is definitely going to be thicker than my thumb, but I've already come up with the solution of hollowing her out so that I can put my second cone in that space. So she's already going to be hollowed out, so that's good news. Looking at the rest of my project, I'd say the only other area that's going to be thicker than my thumb potentially would be a flower. And so say this flower was much larger in person, so I pretend this isn't a mini and I had made a full-size flower, and it's thicker than my thumb. So what I would need to do is flip this guy over and use that loop tool that you created by duct taping your open paper clip edge to that shish kebab stick. So you'll take that handmade loop tool and you're going to scoop out some of that clay from the back so that you can start hollowing it out. Then when you attach it to something, you need to make sure that you give it an escape route. So you don't want to just hollow something out and then put it up against another piece without adding an air hole, because that will trap your air. So you need to be careful that you are not trapping air once you've hollowed out your pieces to avoid them exploding in the kiln. So here's a quick recap for this episode. You're going to create a mini version of your project so that you can work through some of your problems before you're actually making your final project. So you're going to ask yourself these 3 questions after you've made your mini project. The first is, what are my thinnest parts of my project? Those are the areas you're going to save for last when you're creating your project, because you don't want them to dry out too quickly and you won't be able to add things afterwards. So which areas are your thinnest? Next, you're going to ask yourself, what are my most detailed areas? And I would recommend starting with those things, because then you can take the most difficult parts, create it the way that you want it, and then easily match the more simple parts of your project to your detailed piece. The last question you're going to ask yourself is, which areas of my project are thicker than my thumb? That way you can plan out where you need to hollow pieces before you're actually creating it, and you can have a plan in mind of how you're going to do that. Because if you've got any areas thicker than your thumb that are left on your final project, they will explode in the kiln. So those are 3 questions you need to consider before you start on your final project. Thanks for watching!